Okay, so what we want to talk about now is correlation of throwing mechanics with elbow valgus load in adult baseball pitchers. Another way of saying elbow valgus load is an elbow abduction moment, and this is focusing on the external load, and then we'll kind of relate that to the internal load as we go through this. This study was performed in around 70 pitchers, most collegiate, but some minor and major league pitchers. Here we see representation of the throwing cycles. Here we have the wind-up kind of phase, the stepping out, and this is the phase we're most interested in, which is called the cocking phase, when the shoulder is in maximum external rotation and the ball's just before acceleration and release, which we see in this final phase here. And so that's the time point that we're focusing on, because that's when the peak external moment at the elbow is occurring. And if we see here, we can start to do the math on this. If we look at the elbow here, we note that the elbow's flexed, but also the ball and the weight of the ball is acting downward as the person's getting ready to accelerate it. So this is part of like the cocking or the wind-up component. And then here's the axis of the elbow joint here, and there's a joint reaction force that's being actually, in this case, caused by the stabilization of the humerus, so that the proximal segment's stabilized while this distal segment's being torqued into abduction. And so we can see here's the moment arm then that we could calculate, and that would, in a real simple way, give us this external abduction moment at the elbow. And in this particular study, which was done using a dynamic analysis, we can kind of see the balls here. You can't quite see them here, but there's some on the shoulder and the forearm, used to take into account the acceleration of the arm and the inertial properties of the ball. If we take that, the average was 50 Newton meters, but the variation was quite high. It was almost greater than half of the average. So meaning that pitchers had a lot of variety in how much they loaded their elbows during standard pitching tasks. And so they also looked at a couple different types of pitching approaches here. And one that's kind of important is because people do like to use sidearm pitching versus what they call the three-quarter slot. And we can see the three-quarter slots where the arms abducted about 3/4 of a clock from the vertical of the trunk, versus a sidearm, which is about 90 degrees out from the orientation of the trunk. And so there was a bunch of predictors basically on what determined this took into account some of that variation in the abduction moment at the elbow. And what we can see is, when we look down here, is first of all the peak external rotation of the shoulder. So the farther the shoulder got back, then the more valgus load. So that's connected to the shoulder mechanics. And then the second thing at the elbow was a strong predictor of that moment was how much elbow flexion there was. So if there's less elbow flexion, the moment was higher. So the average for the sidearm pitchers was around 66 Newton meters versus the three-quarter slot position, which we see here, is around 44 Newton meters, so significantly less. And then the last important variable was the loading rate. So basically how fast they came out of the external rotated position. If the more acceleration they achieved coming out of that cocking phase, then the higher the valgus moment. So those three items determine basically the loading in the ulnar collateral ligament, or the medial side of the elbow, during pitching.